2:17 a.m. The house sat quietly on the edge of a sleepy suburban street, bathed in the soft glow of a single street lamp. Its light spilled through the living room window, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Inside, everything was exactly as it should be, neat, orderly, and disturbingly calm. The kind of calm that fills a space when nothing seems out of place, when every detail fits so perfectly that it almost feels rehearsed. In the center of the room lay the body. Reclined gently in an armchair, the man's face was serene, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. His hands rested lightly on his lap, fingers uncurled. His breathing had stopped hours ago, but there was no sign of struggle, no trace of violence. No weapon, no blood, no indication that anything was amiss. The air was still. The silence was thick, heavy with a sense of normalcy that refused to break. The scene was so natural, so routine, that when the first responders arrived, they barely hesitated. The paramedics checked for a pulse, found none, and quietly confirmed what everyone assumed: a natural death. The medical examiner's brief glance revealed nothing suspicious. No bruises, no marks, nothing to suggest foul play. The house was locked from the inside, no forced entry, no signs of disturbance. No witnesses had come forward, no alarms had sounded, no calls had been placed. It was as if the man had simply stopped breathing in his chair, in the middle of an ordinary night. For days, the case remained closed, filed away as a tragic but unremarkable passing. It was another name in the death records, another life quietly ended, another routine investigation ended before it began. The paperwork piled up, assumptions settled like dust on forgotten shelves, and the world moved on. Yet, beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, something was quietly wrong. Something too clean, too ordinary, too carefully arranged. The way the shadows fell, the way the clock stopped ticking at the exact moment, the way the man's watch was set precisely to a time that made no sense. The house felt staged, like a set frozen in time, waiting to be noticed. No one believed a murder had taken place. There were no signs to suggest it. But the perfect crime was never about what was visible. It was about what was hidden in plain sight, about a detail so small, so easily overlooked, that no one thought it mattered. That detail refused to fit the story. It was a crack in the flawless facade, a whisper of doubt that would unravel everything. This was not a failure of evidence, nor a slip of the tongue. It was a failure born from the smallest human blind spot, a detail missed by every eye, ignored by every mind. And that detail was about to change everything. The night of the crime was painted with precision. A scene so meticulously arranged it seemed almost too perfect. Every alibi aligned, every piece of evidence pointed elsewhere, and every witness was flawlessly rehearsed. Yet, beneath the polished surface, an unnoticed fracture had begun to widen, quietly threatening the entire narrative. It wasn't the kind of mistake that screams for attention. It was the kind that slips past the sharpest eyes, hidden in plain sight where no one dared to look twice. As the hours passed, the investigators grew more confident in their conclusions, convinced that the puzzle was complete. But the truth, like a shadow lurking just beyond the candlelight, refused to be contained. It was a subtle inconsistency, a whisper in the silence of the crime scene, that held the power to topple the carefully constructed story. Those who believed the case was closed were about to learn that the most devastating errors often come not from what is seen but from what is overlooked. Stay with the story until the very end. The unraveling will reveal how the perfect murder wasn't perfect at all. The clue that brought it down wasn't hidden in a secret room or locked away in a vault. It was right there, where everyone thought they had already looked. It's a reminder that sometimes, the truth waits patiently in the smallest details, daring only the keenest minds to notice. The morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room where the victim lay. When the family discovered the body, it was in a position so natural, so peaceful, that it hardly seemed cause for alarm. There was no frantic shouting, no panicked calls, just a quiet stillness that filled the space like a heavy sigh. The victim's eyes were closed, hands resting calmly by their sides, as if simply asleep. The atmosphere was serene, almost ordinary, and that sense of normalcy shaped everyone's first impression. Family members entered the room one by one, their faces registering a muted concern rather than outright fear. There was no immediate sense of chaos, no desperate attempts to revive or call for help. Instead, they exchanged hushed words, tentative and uncertain, as though trying to convince themselves that this was just a momentary pause, a deep rest. The oldest sibling, usually composed, simply nodded, as if confirming silently that everything appeared intact and unremarkable. The lack of any visible injury or disruption reassured them. There were no signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no scattered belongings. The room was exactly as it had been the night before, untouched and undisturbed. When the authorities arrived, their approach was methodical but unhurried. The officers entered with calm professionalism, taking in the scene without haste. They noted the absence of any forced entry, the neat arrangement of personal items, and the absence of any immediate indicators of foul play. The medical examiner, called in for a routine check, moved through the room with practiced efficiency, confirming what everyone else had already surmised. There was no blood, no marks, no outward signs of trauma. The assumption quickly settled in. The victim had passed quietly, perhaps in sleep or from a natural cause. Neighbors who had heard the news responded with a kind of placid sympathy, their reactions restrained and composed. There were no loud wails or public outcries, just a gentle murmur of condolences and the usual expressions of disbelief that someone so well-regarded and seemingly healthy could be gone. The community's response reinforced the narrative that this was simply an unfortunate but unremarkable death. In conversations around town, phrases like, "nothing suspicious," and "a peaceful passing" became common. The idea of murder was not only absent but inconceivable. Even close friends, who visited the house after the discovery, found themselves comforted by the apparent calm. They remarked on how normal everything looked, how the victim's favorite chair still held its shape, how the coffee cup remained half full on the table, as if time had simply paused. Such details, mundane on the surface, deepened the sense that life had not been violently interrupted. The absence of any visible disturbance lulled everyone into a false sense of security. Within hours, the situation was officially labeled nothing unusual. The police report noted no signs of trauma or forced entry. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested natural causes, and the family's acceptance further grounded this conclusion. The phrase echoed repeatedly in official statements and informal discussions alike, cementing the perception that this was a death that required no further scrutiny. The idea of foul play was dismissed without question, almost as if it were an affront to the natural order. In this quiet acceptance, the seeds of oversight were sown. No one pushed for deeper investigation. No one questioned the calm surface that masked the unknown. The victim's death became just another closed case, filed away with minimal attention. To call it a murder at this stage would have seemed not only premature but absurd. The evidence, or rather the lack of it, painted a picture so convincing in its normalcy that suspicion never found a foothold. Yet, beneath this placid exterior lay the faintest trace of something overlooked, a whisper of detail waiting patiently to be heard. What looked like a peaceful passing was, in truth, the beginning of a story far more complex than anyone could imagine. But in that moment, with no alarms sounded and no chaos unleashed, it was simply a death that raised no alarms at all. The victim's life was characterized by an unremarkable predictability that rendered any anomaly nearly invisible. Their day-to-day routine followed a rigid, unvarying pattern, one that allowed for no surprises and left scant room for external interference. Each morning, they rose at the same hour, consumed a modest breakfast, and embarked on a solitary walk through the neighborhood, returning precisely at the expected time. This consistency created a temporal framework that, when disrupted, would be easily attributed to common causes such as illness or fatigue, rather than foul play. Their social interactions were limited, confined mostly to routine exchanges with a small circle of acquaintances and occasional visits to the local grocery store. The absence of close family or intimate relationships further insulated the victim from scrutiny. Without a network of concerned individuals regularly checking in, discrepancies in their behavior or well-being were less likely to be noticed or reported. This isolation not only minimized the chance of witnesses but also constructed a narrative of solitude that framed any sudden demise as a tragic but unsurprising event. Health-wise, the victim exhibited a history marked by chronic conditions consistent with age and lifestyle, including hypertension and mild cardiac irregularities. These ailments, well documented and medically managed, provided a plausible backdrop for an unexpected death. Medical professionals familiar with the victim's case would naturally lean toward natural causes in the absence of contradictory evidence. The victim's routine medical appointments and prescription records reinforced this expectation, offering a ready-made explanation that required no further investigation. The victim's habits contributed significantly to the seamless integration of their death into the expected progression of their life story. They were known for a sedentary lifestyle, punctuated by occasional walks but largely confined to their residence. The home itself was modest, tidy, and devoid of valuables that might invite theft or violence, eliminating common motives and reducing the likelihood of a thorough forensic examination. The victim's preference for privacy and minimal engagement with neighbors further diminished the probability of surveillance or intervention. Environmental factors also played a role in obscuring the truth. The victim resided in a quiet, low-crime neighborhood where unexpected deaths were rare but not unheard of, often attributed to natural causes or accidents. The community's trust in local law enforcement and medical examiners ensured that cases fitting an established profile were rapidly closed unless overt contradictions emerged. This social context created an atmosphere where a death aligned with known patterns was accepted without question. Furthermore, the victim's financial situation was stable but unremarkable, free from disputes or entanglements that might provoke suspicion. There were no outstanding conflicts, debts, or contentious relationships documented, thereby removing common incentives for harm. The absence of insurance policies or recent changes in financial status avoided red flags that might prompt deeper inquiries. Taken together, these elements forged an environment where the victim's death could be easily rationalized as an unfortunate but natural event. The absence of witnesses, coupled with a predictable lifestyle and a health profile conducive to sudden demise, ensured that the death blended seamlessly into statistical expectations. The victim's solitary existence and lack of social entanglements meant that no one was compelled to question or challenge the surface narrative. In this context, the death was effectively camouflaged within the fabric of everyday reality. The victim stood as the perfect target precisely because their life presented no anomalies, no disruptions to the patterns authorities and acquaintances expected. The circumstances allowed for a death that required no extraordinary explanation, no intensive investigation, and no suspicion. A death that simply was, and therefore would remain unquestioned. The killer's approach was a masterclass in subtlety, an exercise in invisibility that relied on meticulous orchestration rather than brute force. From the outset, there was no room for hasty decisions or impulsive acts. Every step taken was measured, every variable accounted for, and every possibility that could lead back to them carefully neutralized. This was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated disappearance into the background, designed to blend seamlessly with the mundane flow of life. A key element was the deliberate avoidance of any tangible weapon. The killer understood that physical evidence such as a gun, knife, or any instrument left behind would invite scrutiny and unravel the carefully constructed facade. Instead, the method chosen was one that left no conventional traces, no fingerprints on a murder weapon, no blood spatter, no fibers or residues that forensic experts could follow. This decision alone forced the investigation into a blind alley, as it eliminated the usual starting points for detectives. Witnesses were another hurdle that the killer overcame not through intimidation or confrontation, but through patient timing and psychological finesse. The act was planned during a moment when the victim was isolated, yet appeared as naturally as any other instance in their daily routine. The killer observed and learned the victim's schedule to exploit any gaps where no one else could intervene or bear witness. The location chosen was public enough to seem ordinary, but private enough to ensure no unwanted eyes. This balance was critical. An overtly secluded spot would raise questions, but a crowded one risked discovery. The killer's patience in waiting for the perfect moment, when passers-by were distracted, when natural noise masked subtle sounds, was pivotal. Psychological manipulation played a silent but powerful role in the scheme. The killer had invested time in understanding the victim's habits, fears, and relationships, which allowed them to predict how the victim would react in certain situations. This knowledge was weaponized to create a sense of trust or at least complacency. The victim never suspected danger because the killer maintained a facade of normalcy, even appearing as a confidant or a benign presence. This emotional camouflage ensured the victim lowered their guard, making them vulnerable without resistance. The killer's ability to manipulate social dynamics meant no alarms were raised before or after the act. Timing extended beyond the moment of the crime itself. The killer planned the aftermath just as carefully, ensuring that the victim's disappearance or death would be absorbed into the flow of life with minimal disturbance. They anticipated how the victim's absence would be noticed and shaped the circumstances so that no immediate foul play would be suspected. This included subtle interventions, ensuring personal belongings remained untouched, messages unanswered in a way that suggested a simple disappearance rather than violence. The killer's understanding of human psychology allowed them to predict how others would perceive the event, effectively controlling the narrative without a word. The killer also exploited the victim's social environment, selecting a target whose routine and personality naturally deflected suspicion. The victim's predictable life, free of enemies or scandals, meant that no motive could be easily constructed by investigators. This absence of motive was a critical layer of invisibility. Without a clear why, the death was more likely to be dismissed as an accident or a natural cause. The killer's foresight in choosing such a victim underscored the long-term planning involved. It was not just about the act, but about creating a scenario where the act could be erased from memory. In sum, the murder was the result of an invisible plan that depended on patience, precision, and psychological insight. The killer did not need weapons or forced encounters. Instead, they wove a web of subtle manipulations that left no trace. By mastering timing and understanding human nature, the killer ensured that the crime would blend into the everyday, disappearing from suspicion as completely as the victim themselves. This was a calculated vanishing act, a crime designed to be forgotten before it was ever truly discovered. The official cause of death was declared as a sudden, natural cardiac arrest. This conclusion, though seemingly straightforward, was accepted with an almost automatic certainty by doctors, investigators, and authorities alike. The victim's medical history, while not entirely free of risk factors, contained nothing overtly alarming to raise doubts. Without visible signs of trauma or struggle, the death fit neatly into a familiar, almost routine category. This familiarity, rather than curiosity or skepticism, became the driving force behind the acceptance of the official explanation. Medical examiners, constrained by procedural norms and time pressures, performed standard post-mortem examinations that revealed no immediate evidence of foul play. The absence of external injuries or toxic substances in preliminary toxicology reports reinforced the narrative of a natural demise. Autopsy findings emphasized the heart's failure without exploring subtle signs that could have suggested an alternative cause. The pathologist's report, though thorough on paper, relied heavily on conventional interpretations of cardiac arrest in individuals with the victim's profile. Such assumptions overshadowed any lingering questions and effectively closed the door to further inquiry. Investigators, bound by the protocols of routine case management, followed established checklists that prioritized visible, tangible proof. The victim's environment showed no signs of forced entry or disturbance, and no witnesses reported suspicious activity. These facts, or rather the lack of contrary evidence, were taken as confirmation rather than prompts for deeper investigation. The paperwork generated throughout the process reflected a smooth, unbroken chain of events consistent with natural death. Each signature and official stamp lent further credibility to the conclusion, creating an unassailable bureaucratic narrative. The system's reliance on standard operating procedures created an environment where alternative possibilities were not only unlikely to be considered, but were actively discouraged by the inertia of precedent. This institutional momentum favored the simplest explanation, which aligned comfortably with existing frameworks and avoided the complications of prolonged investigations. The victim's death was filed amongst countless others, its paperwork folded neatly into archives that would rarely be revisited. This bureaucratic efficiency, while designed to maintain order, inadvertently became a mechanism for obscuring the truth. Underlying assumptions played a critical role in shaping the outcome. The victim's social standing and the absence of any prior known threats contributed to a collective mindset unwilling to entertain the notion of homicide. Authorities, perhaps unconsciously, allowed these biases to influence their judgment, favoring explanations that preserved the status quo. The killer's meticulous planning exploited these tendencies, weaving a fabric of normalcy that authorities were eager to accept. The seemingly mundane nature of the death became the perfect cover, as no one sought to unravel the threads beneath. In the end, the system itself, comprising medical expertise, investigative routines, and bureaucratic processes, acted as an unintentional accomplice in burying the truth. Rather than illuminating the shadows, these mechanisms cast a veil of legitimacy over a death that was anything but natural. The killer's understanding of these institutional blind spots ensured that the crime would remain hidden in plain sight. It was not a failure of individual diligence, but a systemic vulnerability that allowed a carefully orchestrated deception to succeed, turning the victim's final moments into a silent enigma forever entombed within official records. The morning after the incident, the building hummed with its usual rhythm. The janitorial staff moved through the hallways with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing softly off sterile walls. A faint scent of cleaning agents lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of stale coffee from the break room. On the third floor, the security cameras rotated methodically, capturing mundane scenes of empty corridors and flickering fluorescent lights. These devices, designed to catch anomalies, instead recorded a monotonous parade of routine: locked doors, idle desks, and the occasional passing employee who barely glanced at their surroundings. In the office where the victim had last been seen, a small clock on the wall ticked steadily, its second hand tracing the same circular path without variation. Near the window, a report folder lay closed on the desk, its contents untouched since the previous day. A half-empty coffee mug sat abandoned, stained with a ring of dried residue around the rim. On the floor beneath, a faint scuff mark marred the otherwise spotless carpet, easily overlooked among the myriad of similar imperfections that accumulated in any well-used space. Meanwhile, in the building's control room, the security personnel monitored an array of screens, each displaying grainy, black and white footage from different angles. Their eyes flicked over the images, noting nothing out of the ordinary. The logbook was updated as usual, with entries marking the times when doors were locked or unlocked, visitors signed in and out, and routine maintenance checks completed. One technician adjusted the brightness on a monitor, then returned to scrolling through emails, the screens serving more as background noise than active surveillance tools. Outside, the city carried on with indifferent momentum. Traffic lights cycled through their predictable patterns, street vendors arranged their carts, and pedestrians passed by without a second glance at the imposing building where the tragedy had unfolded. The local newspaper's headline that day mentioned a variety of unrelated events: sports scores, weather forecasts, and community announcements. The death, officially listed under a generic cause, elicited little more than a brief mention buried deep within the pages, its significance drowned out by the routine pulse of everyday life. Back inside, the victim's personal effects remained untouched in a small locker near the elevator. A worn-out umbrella leaned against the wall, and a set of keys dangled from a hook, their metallic jingle lost amid the ambient sounds of the building. An innocuous detail, yet one that passed unnoticed even as investigators shuffled through the scene with clinical detachment. The security system's logs showed no irregular entries for that day, and the janitor's checklist confirmed that all common areas had been cleaned and secured without incident. At the nearby cafe frequented by employees, conversations drifted toward mundane topics: weekend plans, the latest television shows, and office gossip. No one mentioned the incident beyond a passing comment, quickly eclipsed by laughter and the clatter of coffee cups. The barista wiped down the counter, periodically glancing at the clock, unaffected by the undercurrent of something unresolved in the building just blocks away. Even the emails exchanged between staff that morning seemed devoid of urgency. A request for supplies, a reminder about an upcoming meeting, a casual note about a colleague's birthday. None hinted at the gravity lurking beneath the surface. The digital chatter flowed uninterrupted, a stream of banal communication that masked the silent anomaly embedded within the day's events. In all these fragments, the ticking clock, the camera's gaze, the unremarkable scuff on the carpet, there lay a detail so small and routine that it blended seamlessly into the background, an element that, without a deliberate pause to notice, would remain invisible, dismissed as irrelevant noise in the vast machinery of institutional function. It was neither flashy nor dramatic, offering no immediate clue or spark of suspicion, simply a quiet, everyday fragment of a day that seemed otherwise ordinary, waiting unnoticed in the shadows of a carefully constructed facade. The room hummed softly with the low murmur of voices and the shuffling of papers, as if the very air was reluctant to break the fragile calm. Amid the steady rhythm of routine, a subtle shift took place, not in a gesture, nor in a glance, but in the faintest flicker of awareness. It was a detail so small, so fleeting, that it might have been passed over countless times before, had it not settled quietly, persistently, in the corner of someone's mind. No one spoke it aloud at first. The thought arrived in a hesitant whisper, a shadow of a question that hovered just beyond the edge of certainty. It was not a sudden realization or a dramatic epiphany, but rather a slow, creeping unease, like the first chill of dawn brushing against closed eyelids. The person who noticed it tried to dismiss it, tried to fold it away among the countless distractions of the day. Yet, the question refused to be silenced. There was a pause, brief and almost imperceptible, as if the mind was holding its breath. The detail in question was insignificant on the surface. A misplaced paper, a faint smudge on a letter, a time noted where no one had expected one to be. Nothing that shouted for attention, nothing that demanded confrontation. But it was there, quietly stubborn, nudging gently against the edges of what had been accepted without question. The hesitation was palpable. The observer's eyes drifted back to the detail again, slow and careful. Was it really out of place? Or was the unease merely a trick of fatigue or imagination? The question was delicate. It did not accuse or condemn. It simply lingered, refusing to be dismissed, a small knot of doubt tightening quietly amid the certainty that had settled like dust in the room. Around them, conversations continued, laughter and light remarks filling the spaces between official discussions. No one else seemed to notice. The machinery of the institution turned on, its parts moving smoothly, confidently, as if nothing could disrupt the rhythm. Yet beneath that surface, the quiet question took root, growing in the silent spaces where certainty faltered. The observer caught themselves staring longer than intended, a subtle unease pulling at the edges of their attention. They knew this was not a certainty, not an accusation, just a whisper of doubt that had slipped through the cracks in the carefully maintained narrative. It was a question that did not demand answers but refused to vanish, a faint pulse lingering beneath the veneer of order. No words were spoken yet. It was too early for that. The doubt was still fragile, a delicate thread weaving its way through the fabric of the day. To speak it aloud would be to risk exposure, to crack the surface of calm. Instead, the question remained unvoiced, a silent intruder in the mind's quiet chambers. It was a subtle fracture, a momentary hesitation that shattered nothing but quietly unsettled everything. As the minutes passed, the observer's gaze drifted away, but the question stayed behind, like a faint echo that would not fade. It hovered in the periphery, a soft, persistent presence that neither demanded nor denied, simply existed. The moment doubt entered the story was not marked by certainty or revelation, but by a quiet refusal to look away. And in that refusal, a story began to shift, slowly, irrevocably, toward something unknown. The detail that had once seemed inconsequential now refused to be dismissed. It was a subtle anomaly, a fragment that didn't fit neatly into the timeline meticulously assembled by the investigators. The prevailing narrative, carefully constructed from witness statements, forensic reports, and alibis, suddenly wavered in the face of this contradiction. It wasn't a glaring error, but a whisper of inconsistency, a misstep in the choreography of events that, when scrutinized, unraveled the entire sequence. Initially, the detail was buried beneath layers of assumptions. Medical reports had established a window of time during which the victim's condition deteriorated, and those reports were regarded as definitive. Yet, the detail clashed with these timelines. It suggested a moment, an action, a presence that should have been impossible according to the accepted chronology. The victim's vital signs, the medication schedules, and the official statements all pointed to a closed chapter, but this new element reopened it. It was as if the clock had been reset to a time everyone believed was locked away. The habits and routines of those involved, which had once been solid grounds for alibis, now appeared porous. The detail exposed a gap in the daily patterns, an irregularity that had escaped notice because it was so small. This wasn't a glaring absence but a subtle shift in behavior. A late-night call, a misplaced object, a hushed conversation. These were the cracks in the facade, and they begged the question. Had the investigators been blinded by the comfort of certainty? The detail forced them to confront the possibility that some actions had slipped past their radar, unnoticed but critically important. Medical assumptions were among the hardest to challenge. The doctor's conclusions, based on established protocols and scientific observations, had been treated almost as gospel truth. But this detail suggested a different physiological response, one that didn't align with known patterns of trauma or medication effects. It was a nuance in the victim's condition, an unexpected resilience or vulnerability that contradicted the medical narrative. This forced the medical experts to revisit their analyses, to question their own data, and to accept that the body's story might not be as straightforward as they had believed. Official statements, too, began to unravel. Those sworn testimonies, once pillars of the investigation, revealed inconsistencies when measured against this newfound detail. The timing of certain declarations, the sequence of reported events, and even the tone of some testimonies no longer matched the emerging picture. It wasn't a matter of deliberate deception but of human error, memory's frailty, and the subtle shifts in perception under stress. This introduced an uncomfortable doubt about the reliability of the established narrative and compelled the investigators to re-examine every statement with renewed skepticism. As the gravity of the detail became undeniable, the entire investigation entered a state of recalibration. The certainty that had once anchored the case dissolved, replaced by a landscape of questions and possibilities. Every theory was put back on the table. Every assumption was tested. The investigators, once confident in their conclusions, now found themselves navigating a maze of contradictions and uncertainties. The detail had not only disrupted their timeline but also challenged their methods, their biases, and their very understanding of what had occurred. This shift was more than procedural, it was psychological. Recognizing that the detail could no longer be ignored meant acknowledging that the story everyone believed was settled was, in fact, incomplete. It demanded humility and intellectual honesty. The investigators had to admit that in their pursuit of closure, they had overlooked the subtle threads that, when woven together, told a different story, one with new suspects, altered motives, and unforeseen consequences. In the end, this detail transformed the investigation from a closed case into an open question. It revealed that the truth was elusive, layered, and often hidden in plain sight. The quiet refusal to look away had blossomed into a relentless pursuit of answers, pushing the boundaries of the known and inviting a deeper exploration of the shadows where certainty once dwelled. The detail was no longer a mere footnote. It was the key that unlocked the door to everything that had been missed. The unraveling began with a single, almost imperceptible anomaly, a tiny thread pulled loose from the fabric of the carefully constructed narrative. For months, every piece of evidence had fit seamlessly, every testimony aligned like clockwork. The murder, as it seemed, was flawless. No witnesses, no motive left unexplained, and a meticulously staged scene that pointed unerringly to the supposed guilty party. Yet, hidden within the minutiae that most had dismissed as trivial, lay the fatal flaw. It was a speck, a microscopic fragment of something no one had thought to scrutinize closely. At first glance, it seemed irrelevant, an inconsequential particle, a mere whisper amid the symphony of forensic data. But once illuminated by a sharp, inquisitive eye, it became a paradoxical beacon, impossible to ignore. This minute detail contradicted the entire timeline. It shattered alibis and exposed fabrications with a clarity that was both startling and undeniable. What made the collapse so profoundly ironic was the contrast between the scale of planning and the scale of the flaw. Years of scheming, every variable accounted for, every escape route plotted with precision, undone by a single microscopic element. The vastness of the conspiracy was brought low by something so small it might have been overlooked by chance. Had it not been for the unyielding curiosity of the investigator who refused to accept the neat conclusion. As the threads began to unravel, the case morphed from a closed book into a labyrinthine puzzle. The initial certainty that had comforted the authorities and haunted the accused gave way to doubt. The flaw was like a crack in a diamond's flawless surface. Once seen, it could never be unseen. It exposed the illusion of perfection, reminding everyone involved that no plan, no matter how meticulously crafted, could escape the unpredictable nature of reality. With this revelation, every other piece of evidence was re-examined under a new light. What had once seemed to confirm guilt was now reinterpreted as circumstantial or even misleading. Witness statements, once taken at face value, revealed inconsistencies. The timeline, painstakingly assembled, showed gaps and overlaps that undermined the original theory. The microscopic detail had become the fulcrum on which the entire case pivoted, turning suspicion away from the assumed culprit and opening the door to new possibilities. The implications rippled outward, unsettling the confidence of those who had been certain of the outcome. Detectives who had closed the case with a sense of accomplishment now faced the humbling task of admitting oversight. The accused, once resigned to fate, found a glimmer of hope as the narrative shifted beneath their feet. Public perception shifted too, from judgment to curiosity, from certainty to questioning. This shift was not merely procedural, it was existential. The flaw underscored a fundamental truth about the pursuit of justice. It is vulnerable to the smallest oversights, the tiniest details that can overturn an entire edifice of assumptions. It was a reminder that the truth is not always grand or dramatic. It often hides in the subtle, the overlooked, the seemingly insignificant. As the investigation reopened, the microscopic detail continued to exert its quiet but relentless influence. It demanded attention, forced reconsideration, and refused to be relegated to the margins. Each new discovery linked back to it, reinforcing its central role in unraveling the murder that had once seemed perfect. The irony was unmistakable. The very complexity designed to conceal the crime had been undone by simplicity, a single, tiny flaw impossible to ignore once revealed. In the end, the case stood as a testament to the fragile nature of perfection in crime. No matter how thoroughly a plan is executed, the smallest imperfection can bring the entire structure crashing down. And once that imperfection is seen, it changes everything, forever altering how the story is told, who is believed, and what justice ultimately demands. Perfection, by its very nature, demands repetition. It insists on consistency, on flawless execution that leaves no room for error. But this very insistence is its undoing. When a crime is planned with meticulous care, every detail weighed and every variable accounted for, it creates a rhythm, a pattern woven so tightly that any deviation becomes glaringly obvious. The perfect murder is not just an isolated event. It is a sequence, a signature, a blueprint inadvertently left behind. This is why such crimes, despite their initial success, often unravel, not because of eyewitnesses stepping forward or smoking gun evidence suddenly surfacing, but because the perfection itself betrays the perpetrator. In the quiet corners of investigation rooms, seasoned detectives learn to read between the lines, to see the invisible thread that connects seemingly unrelated details. They recognize that the flawless crime is a paradox. It must be repeated with exactness to be deemed perfect, yet repetition invites recognition. Patterns emerge from the shadows, subtle but unmistakable. The more a killer strives for perfection, the more predictable they become, trapped within their own design. A single overlooked detail, a momentary lapse, or even an unknowingly shared habit can crack the facade, allowing truth to seep through the cracks. This realization transforms how we view justice. It's no longer about catching the murderer red-handed or uncovering a piece of undeniable proof. It becomes a game of patience, intuition, and relentless pursuit of the intangible. The perfect crime is never truly perfect because human nature resists absolute control. Flaws, sometimes microscopic and imperceptible, persist, threading through the narrative like a faint heartbeat in the silence. These flaws whisper secrets, and it is in listening to them that justice finds its way. As the story fades into the shadows, it leaves behind a haunting question. How many perfect crimes have slipped through the cracks, never to be seen or solved? How many stories remain buried, their patterns hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right observer to unravel them? The line between order and chaos is razor-thin, and every attempt to impose perfect order on chaos risks creating a new pattern, one that will inevitably be deciphered. Now, as we close this chapter, we invite you to step deeper into the abyss where silence and secrets intertwine. Join us for the next story, a crime so elusive it almost vanished forever. It is a tale that will linger in your mind long after the final word, unsettling and impossible to forget. Watch closely, listen carefully, and prepare yourself to confront the shadows where perfection and imperfection collide. The next story awaits, and with it, the revelation that even the darkest mysteries hide patterns waiting to be uncovered.